Good evening. It's the Growth Planning Committee meeting. It's 6 o'clock on April 15th. Why don't we do introductions? I'm Paul Hogan. I'm acting as chair tonight in Dan's absence. Start over there. Tom?
I'm Tom Smith.
Rob Wingle.
Jane Evelyn. Ann Martin.
Galen Widley, support staff.
Nadia Crockett-Curran, support staff.
Thank you all very much. Would someone like to, we record and transcribe the minutes, but would someone like to look them over and make sure they're okay? Because Liz, our secretary, is not here. I'm looking both ways.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
I'll do my best.
Okay, so they'll get sent to you first, and then you can play with them if they need to be played with. Shorten them, cut them down. Yeah, and we don't need to, obviously, what's most important is when we make decisions and take votes, we don't have to have every word in the minutes, because there is the recording. Anyone, if there's ever a question about who said what, we can always go back and look. First item is to review and approve minutes, which Liz sent around a while ago. Do I have any comments, questions?
I move that we accept the minutes.
Okay, all in favor?
Is there a second?
A second.
Oh, thank you very much. Ann seconded. And all in favor? I'm going to vote yes. I watched on TV,
Yes.
so I can vote. Thank you.
So that was a 5-0 vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and the item on our agenda is continuing discussion for the past two meetings, I guess, on agritourism and the issues we've talking about in terms of our farms in town. We did get a memo from our team on some of the questions which were asked. Do you want to quickly, in case anyone's watching? Is anyone online? We should ask that question. No. Nope. But for the sake of people who don't have access to the memo, perhaps just a quick follow-up on what you found.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of research just on some other municipalities in Maine, and one in New Hampshire and one in Massachusetts. And basically what I found is that there's not really a consistent definition. Well, there's a pretty consistent definition, which is basically just activities related to agriculture that are done on a farm as part of that agricultural use. The wording changes based on the municipality. But in terms of every other regulation, they seem very inconsistent. So some municipalities have a limit based on how much land you have. Some have limits on the number of events you can have each year. Some have limits depending on the type of event. So it's not consistent across any of them. Some have a definition for agritourism, but don't have any kind of regulation further than that. So I think it was interesting to see, and so hopefully everyone had a chance to look it over and kind of give us ideas about moving forward for Kennebunkport, like which municipalities does the committee like the ideas of, which don't you like the ideas of, and we can work from there. But in terms of seeing a consistent trend through everything, there isn't one near as I can tell. Outside of the fact that clearly it's a trend in that municipalities are seeing the need to create ordinances that monitor this.
And would you say, of the ones you looked at, I haven't gone and asked this question of myself, I could, how many were farm dependent, like related to the farming activity versus a wedding, which is not related to a farming activity and would just be a supplemental income that happened to be on a farm?
I think that most of them don't really make that distinction between, I think what we've been calling agritainment versus agritourism. There's not really that distinction. So agritourism kind of lumps all of that together for most of these towns.
It seems to be supplemental to agriculture. No, I mean, they refer to agriculture in these descriptions, but I guess it seems to me that most of them were somewhat agriculture oriented, but maybe not limited to. They give you activities, but then they always say, but not limited to these.
Mhm.
So
Right.
it gives you,
I think the
a lot of leeway.
strictest one in terms of actual activities was Owl's Head, which is very specific about, like, they actually have farm-to-table dinners are a specific event that's regulated. So I think that was I agree with Jane, like, most of them were a little broader, but Owl's Head was very specific about which events were allowed.
In the absence of a definition, can we make up our own definitions
Of course.
for these three? I recommend we do that. A definition for agritourism versus agrotainment versus something different like weddings. And I'm not objecting to having other activities, because we made the point very clear last week, or 2 weeks ago, that they need revenue to keep the farm going, which is in our best interest as well. So I have no objection to having non-agro activities that are helping to sustain the agricultural entity. But we should be very clear in our own minds which bucket those three types of things fall in. I'm suggesting 3 buckets, and we define those with a couple of sentences each.
I mean, we don't even have to have those terms
Right.
in our,
Okay.
if you have a farm, you might be able to do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, for example, Cumberland they have a definition for agritourism, but the one that's actually regulated is what they define as a farm-based special event,
Right.
which is its own definition that's heavily regulated, whereas agritourism is not mentioned anywhere else in their ordinances. So, yes, the purpose of this exercise is to kind of give you guys just a view of what other people are doing, but we are looking to create this ordinance language with the GPC. So certainly, certainly we're looking to write our own language and make it tailored a little bit to Kennebunkport and what our needs are.
Well,
Go ahead, Tom. Let
So
finish your
one thing I'm concerned about is, we probably, if we tell the community, our town, we're doing these kinds of things to sustain the agricultural industry in our town, people are gonna say, what does a wedding have to do with agriculture? And it has nothing to do with it, except
Right.
the fact that it brings in necessary revenue to sustain the agricultural entity. Again, no objection to doing that. We gotta be very clear as to, if we're promoting agro-tourism, agro-business, whatever it is, we're not talking about including weddings in that definition.
So I think that this is kind of, when we first started having this conversation a few meetings ago, Galen thoughtfully broke it down for us between agritourism and agritainment. So I think what you're picturing is agritainment, which is farm-adjacent entertainment activity. So like a wedding would be, I would think that it would classify as agritainment, because you're right, like, people aren't out in the fields while they're getting married, but they are, getting married in a barn because they like the farm aesthetic. So I think that that's the distinction you're looking for. Agritourism is like, you stay on the farm and you work the fields. Agritainment is, you want to have a concert next to the farmland.
But how do you address some townsperson's request, who has a big tract of land, to turn his place into a wedding venue?
I think that's what we're here to discuss.
But it has nothing to do with the farm. I don't know anybody in that.
Well, that's what I call a faux farm. Meaning, first of all, we don't really have that much farming in our community. We have one, Helene's farm used to be a farm. It's a landscaping business, and she opened up a bit of a community garden because she went out of the farming business, out of the growing of, of food. And they have a landscaping business, which is a farm under Maine law. To me, I was surprised that was considered a farm, but it is a proper use. We have 5 Acre Farm, which is a pie production factory, which does a great job. I love them. I wish they weren't around. My potbelly in the summer would be a little less. But we don't really have much, what traditional farming.
Does Rocking Horse Farm actually do farming?
I think they're a horse stable, and that's considered farming. They're
Okay.
animal husbandry. That's farming.
Yeah. And of course, they have Circus Smirkus, which has nothing to do with farming.
Right, that's an adjacent. And I know you may have told us, do they get a special event permit?
So it's a special event mass gathering permit. And as we discussed at prior meetings, the town solicitor does not like the practice that we've been doing with that, in that it's blurring the lines between land use and permitted activities. And so that's why we're trying to really curb what the intent of those mass gatherings are to more public events like street closure, like you're doing, you know, a block party or something to that effect, where resources are being used to really direct traffic and public resources, versus just on each parcel, it's allowed these commercial gatherings. So that's really the change that we're looking to do here.
So how would, if I had a big property and I wanted to do a wedding and have 251 people coming, I would, in the current world, get a special events permit, and in the future world, what would I do?
In the future world, we'd be able to curb that. So they wouldn't be able to do those types of activities.
Because
on
you're
the property.
contemplating getting rid of
Correct.
special, okay, I'm not
Because
aware.
it's a commercial, because there's the commercial.
No, it's not commercial, it's just a large wedding. I'm one of 11 kids.
Well, if it's
Didn't
for
have any-
family, we don't regulate families. That's not something that we regulate.
But if
it's
I
the
had
commercial
260
aspect
people, wouldn't I be required to get a permit
for
for a
for
large
families,
wedding?
for your family or friends.
Yeah.
Without compensation.
Yeah.
No, you just need to get a tent permit from the clerk. Tent permits, you're allowed to get if you're having a tent out for outside wedding. That's
Yeah.
what you would. But we don't regulate, like, you have a birthday party at your house. We don't
Of course
regulate those
not.
activities. We don't want to regulate those activities.
No, nor
But you want to be invited.
Yes.
At the risk of being a contrarian,
Yeah.
and I appreciate we've all learned a lot about this over the past several weeks, and thanks for all the research. I wonder if part of the challenge is it's not that pervasive. We don't have that many farms in town. We don't have that many large tracts of land. And as such, we're trying to solve for something that's really not a pervasive problem, and trying to get language that provides, I think what you're looking for is, we need some guidelines so that we are benchmarking any exceptions against guidelines. But I think we're gonna struggle to anticipate all the various uses. And I don't know, it sounds like the volume of exceptions being requested is not that high. So is it better to be left for, come in and request an exception?
I think that
So again, I'll quickly address that comment. So right now, we don't have a good definition in our land use ordinance to deal with these types of wedding events. And we see that there is a trend of people that have interest in doing this, and we talked about private properties
Right.
that are currently trying to put this on Tie the Knot and advertise it. And
Which
so,
are not farms.
which are not farms.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is get some language in the land use ordinance that we at least tailor what these events look like and prevent them from just going under the auspices of of restaurant use, because that's all we really have is a close, similar use to who conducts any kind of events, or weddings. You know, you would usually have them on a restaurant, or you'd have them at hotel, hospitality establishments. Those are customarily, besides churches, you'd customarily have those types of ceremonies at those establishments. And so that's the closest definition we have currently. We would like to rather define it that way. If they don't meet that criteria, they're easily denied an application if they want to try to do a wedding event venue.
And can I just
But-
pick on one thing?
Yep.
We keep calling it weddings, and that's where there's
Right.
a trend. But it could be birthday parties, it could be funerals, it could be it could be concerts, it could be farm and table dinners. So I think we need to recognize that it's not limited necessarily to weddings as well, right?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, I'd say that there is other uses that you have in the ordinance that deal with, like, social halls. Like, those had abilities to do those types of social functions. But you're seeing a trend in the market of people having, especially weddings, in agricultural barns and other settings like that. So we're just trying to, again, curb that to,
So some of the things that I saw, well, one of the things was, one of them required bathrooms be provided. And actually, I kind of think the first one here, Gorham, was pretty good. And they are, I may be the only one that referred to bathrooms need to be provided for all attendees. And then, I thought I saw somewhere, about, and maybe it was in the email that was sent, about, the width of the street.
I think that's
That was,
Cumberland.
yeah,
Yep.
it had to be a proper street.
Mhm.
Couldn't,
So you can't have, you know, a driveway with 12 units going down that's, 10 feet wide is not.
Right, so I think
Eligible.
maybe some kind of restrictions like that would be good in anything that we do. And I don't know how wide this, well, I guess where Rocking Horse Farm is, or where Black Rock Farm is, I guess that's a wide enough street for.
but there's,
I don't know what
but
the
there would be no parking on the street. There
Right,
isn't a road into those places.
yeah.
So you're either parking on the street, which is what I guess they do for the circus, or they put them in the fields. They
They
must put them in.
yeah, people
I've never
go into
gone.
the field,
Yeah. They use the field and ruin the farm, but when you're growing hay, you can do that. You just cut your hay right before. I guess I'm wondering, while you say this is a trend, why does Kennebunkport have to be all things to everybody? When we put together the comprehensive plan, there was a lot of tension between the residents of the town and preserving neighborhoods and a sense of community, and we can't drive in the town anymore for 3 months or 4 months. You can't get through, and we can't go to restaurants because they're all booked in the summertime because of the tourists. And so, and yet our bread and butter, of course, in this town is tourism. It's our largest industry. But do we need, right now we don't have, I don't know what the Nonantum's wedding capacity is. It's probably the largest in town, I would guess, or the Colony. And maybe that's 200 people, 250. I'm trying to think how many they jam in for that ice show. But I'm, as sure as I'm sitting here, and we have these large, big corporate interests buying up the town, and I'm sure that if we put something in that says that you can have, you can start having wedding halls out in, these semi-permanent tents that get put up and have, large weddings where we don't have the capacity now. People who own hotels would love to have larger weddings, so more rooms are filled at higher prices. And do we really, the
So
forest,
Are you suggesting
the
that
forest and farm,
by articulating this, do we actually open it up?
yes, absolutely, we would. We would.
I
Now,
think
if we said no more than 50 people, that would seem crazy, because let's say someone put up a hayfield or a cornfield, which we don't have one in town, but let's say someone raised corn and they wanted to do a maze. Well, of course, no one would object to, 250 people coming in the daytime to go through the maze, or 550 people if you could figure out the parking and all that. But if we have loud weddings every weekend on Arundel Road, those areas are zoned farm and forest.
I think it's worth noting
For a
here
reason.
that the purpose of the ordinance is not necessarily to.
No,
Oh,
but when you, I mean, this town has gotten burnt
Sure.
before by allowing, by allowing certain kinds of housing, and we end up with a resort.
Sure. So,
And-
as I was going to say, so the purpose of the ordinance is not necessarily to allow greater, it's not necessarily to allow the town to be overrun with weddings. I think the purpose is in some ways to regulate and actually decrease the gray area where people, there is some certain wiggle room that we are trying to remove. And at the same time, in order to preserve the rural character of Kennebunkport, give farms another avenue for revenue that is regulated. So you'll see, a lot of these allow maybe 2 or 3 events per month with a maximum of Gorham's has a maximum of 10 per year with only 3 per month. So they're still heavily regulated, but allowing farms to take advantage of the summer season and get, a little bit more revenue that they aren't necessarily able to just through
Can I
agricultural
go back to,
production.
Go ahead,
I'm
Rob.
feeling we're trying to solve multiple things, and I'm not sure we're crystal clear on what we're solving for. Is it weddings on private property that were not intended, or other big social gatherings that were not intended for that purpose, so they're not hospitality, where there's some commerce, so there's some financial exchange that's occurring? Is it specifically farms only, and agritourism and agritainment? I think there are multiple things that have gotten intermingled here a bit. And so I'm wondering, if we bring back to what problem we're trying to solve, is it large gatherings that have commerce associated with it that we want to put some more guidance around, be it a farm, be it a large piece of private property, be it Airbnb or any property, because we've come back a lot to the agri part of it, but I think the original problem was people advertising Airbnbs that can be used for weddings. So is it more about the size and nature of gatherings that are commercially oriented, that have a fee associated with them, that we're trying to solve?
Could I
So, yeah.
ask, oh, sorry.
So I'll respond with giving everyone a little bit of an education on municipal land use planning. And so with land use planning, unless prohibited by state law, so unless the state authorizes you to prohibit a certain activity, i.e. marijuana. So it was an opt-in provision. The town has to allow the particular use in some of its zones in town. You have to pick, and when you don't have a well-defined use, you have to pick a close alternative for that use. So what the town is concerned about is how we can find a better alternative use, and the town has realized there is a trend in the market that people are interested in farms. And so is there a way that we can keep this contained to an agricultural focus, which is one of your strategies in your comprehensive plan, that the board did say they wanted to explore agritourism as a possible use. So that is what we're looking at here is, yes, we're hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. We do notice that there is a use that does not have a good definition in our land use ordinance, and we're also trying to address a comprehensive plan strategy, which we think would be a good policy for the town to preserve our farms and maybe even bring some farms back. That's enough said.
What would be helpful to me is really to maybe narrow the different topics that we're bringing and having a definition of what that is. So I look at this and I think, okay, I have, what language am I using, which would be helpful for, implementing or adding or suggesting for the ordinances. But are we talking, and this is a terrible way to refer to it, but I actually started calling it agri-wedding just so that I could differentiate what I was thinking about. But first of all, I do have a question. What zone are we looking at for the addressing a wedding on a farm? What zone are we looking at of the 3 zones in the town?
I was, again, it's up to the board what you think that would be the most appropriate use. I would definitely think your free enterprise zone is one of your larger zones in town. And then we would also, I think, maybe consider, depending on, again, the site, and we can analyze it, but maybe the ag forestry and forest farming zone, because that is where agriculture is predominantly taking place. But that's, again, the board decides where you think that it'd be more appropriate to have. I just think keeping it outside of the residential areas it makes sense.
So we're looking at a free enterprise zone and an agricultural forestry zone primarily right now in our conversations. My next question would be, do we have a title for this? Is it going to be, for example, are we talking about a permitted use? And that would be weddings. Are we talking?
Conditional use.
A conditional use. So we're talking about a conditional use. So in our discussions, then we would need to know that we can implement certain conditions. So that might be of some assistance. I know that one of the concerns that I had was in creating an unintended use of, if you have a large parcel of land, and I certainly value the idea of going to a farm and living on a farm and experiencing a farm. But one of my concerns is if you have that farm sold now and you've permitted buildings to allow overnight accommodation, could that in effect become like a hotel? Do you have an unintended consequence of several overnight accommodation units? So
Yeah.
that's why I'm trying to look at what conditions are we going to permit? And if we're talking about weddings, I just feel like we should narrowly address what the conditions are that we think would benefit the community in the long run to discuss at this time. I don't, just so, that would be helpful to me.
I'd like to go, one step maybe further back from your point. Going back to that last meeting, I had the impression that our objective, I use that term, was really to basically ensure the survival of the agribusiness in this town. It's a nice, it's a rural atmosphere, it's nice to have and so forth and so on, and it's gonna die off if we don't do some things to sustain that, especially with the encroachment of some of these large, hotels and restaurants and so forth and so on. And, I was under the impression that we were trying to ensure the survivability of people like the farm people we talked to 2 weeks ago, and letting them do non-traditional farming activities, agribusiness, agritourism, maybe a wedding on their property, was a way to give them revenue to sustain their livelihood, to make them continue to be viable. Had nothing to do with bringing in some people from Nonantum and so forth to hold conferences and so forth and so on, which does nothing other than give them some rental income, but allows Nonantum to really juice up their business a lot. So taking your point, I think talking about objectives, what do we want to see this town be and become, I think we should really be our guiding stars here as to how we treat this problem. Because it could be, the restaurant business has different objectives, the hotels have different objectives, farms have different objectives, et cetera. What really do we want this town to look like, 10, 20, 100 years from now?
If we look at what Gorham did, I don't know if everybody sees
Yeah.
that, but what they wrote, it's everything they talk about in here is like on a farm, cultural activities, harvest your own activities, marketing and selling of products, like they might do it like 5 Acre Farm, ice cream, bakery facilities, maple events, Christmas tree farm. But at the end, everything is very much related to the farming experience, except then the last sentence talks about weddings, corporate events, retreats, and banquets. And I feel like those things are separate. And maybe if our objective is to help the farms support themselves, maybe we don't really want to have weddings, corporate events, retreats, and banquets, because they have nothing to do with the farming experience directly.
But I do think we're at a loss because we don't have a clear objective. I think you're right. Is the objective help farms sustain? Because generating income from non-farming activity would help them sustain themselves.
Yeah, but they could also sustain themselves in things that are more farming oriented, possibly. Maybe they're not
Except-
big money
Right.
makers.
Yeah,
Exactly.
except we don't have those, for the most part,
Right.
those kinds of farms generating those kinds of. But
Because
I have a question. Free enterprise and
Agricultural board.
ag. So if I bought a piece of land tomorrow, a 10-acre property, it's not a farm, it's just hills and vales and whatever.
Or it's fallow land that was farmed at one point.
Yeah.
It hasn't been farmed for a
Right.
while. Yep.
Can I set up a wedding business there? Put up one of those, permanent or semi-permanent trucks and bring in food trucks every weekend and, cater and have, I've been to weddings like this. You know, can I do that in free enterprise?
So in free enterprise, where that was where Black Rock Farms was, they wanted to do a greater frequency than what they had.
No, but
Yeah,
there's no farm there. This is just not a
Yeah,
farm.
it
I'm
was
just
it was a
asking about
restaurant.
the free.
Restaurant use is allowed in the free enterprise.
Okay, so I could set up a restaurant
Yep,
if I, but I would
Absolutely.
have to meet restaurant standards,
Yep.
et cetera. Could
And
I?
go through site plan review process and get conditions from the planning board.
Right. So can I do it on the cheap, not a permanent building? Can I go with tents and fancy bathrooms?
You can try.
And
You go to the planning board and ask them. I don't know what they're going to say.
So how,
So that's what Helene did. I mean, Helene is using her greenhouses that are on the site, and she's bringing tents in. And
right, no, I'm just
Yep.
asking about. I'm
Yep.
not.
oh yeah, you can go in front of the board and ask what you want, and they may say yes, they might say no. I don't know what they'll say.
so what I don't understand is that if you, it almost sounds as though you have without there being the, you know, the actual wedding ceremony, it sounds like you have basically a wedding event. If you can bring in trucks and you can serve food, and, I mean, isn't that what we do at a wedding? We eat and we sit together and we
and listen to
gather,
music.
and it may or may not be a ceremony. So we seem to be doing that, permitting that to some extent. And so now we're just
But we
trying
don't have
to add
any-
the language of, and a conditional use of a wedding.
We're trying to narrow that focus. That way, it's clearly intended to address a policy issue in town, and you can't then go and get a restaurant use and try to get something that's more vague. So we're trying to, again, keep it that it's contained to a use that's sort of directed towards an agricultural.
So in doing that, you come in and you're saying, okay, I'd like to have a wedding here, 2 weddings a year, let's say, at my farm. So I would come in and get permission ahead of time, and it would be perhaps, I would say, there'll be 200 people per event, and then there will be a conversation. But those definitions of how many people would be there, would that be more in the zoning ordinance as a specific, as opposed to the growth planning, the comprehensive plan?
So it'd be in the land use ordinance, it'd be a performance standard. You'd be putting a limit on what the size of the attendance would be.
So we're really looking at the overall concept, which then is more narrowly defined elsewhere.
Yep. So you're taking the vision, which the vision was the strategy of, you wanted to promote agritourism, farmers markets, there's other things in that strategy that we mentioned at the last meeting. And we're now trying to implement that into the land use ordinance.
Let me ask you a question. Last week, 2 weeks, I heard the woman from the Nanton talk about, here's an idea to help the farm generate revenue to stay in business. We're gonna have events, we're gonna have seminars, we're gonna have corporate meetings. We the farm rent out the space to the Nanton to bring people in. We'll get the revenue. There's nothing to do with farming and so forth, but helps the farm make revenue and stay in business. Where does that trajectory stop? In other words, can you now have empty space and bring in migrant factory workers and do piecework to assemble parts that go someplace else to be put into a product? Where does that I guess rationale of doing something on a farm that generates revenue for the farm by leasing the property to somebody else in order to sustain the business in the farm, but it has nothing to do with the farm business per se? I'm just kind of wondering how lenient do we get, and how slippery is that slope we're about to go on to take all these non-weddings and take it from there down to other things like having manufacturing on the farm?
So again, that's a conditional use. Right now, the slippery slope is contained by a conditional use process. So they have to go in front of the planning board, and then there's conditions placed on that. So you heard with Nonantum and the Black Rock Farm partnership that they are limited to, I believe it's 8 events per year. And they can't have amplified music. Like, those were all voluntary standards that the planning board and the applicant came together and said, this is what we think would be reasonable to protect the health, safety, and welfare and the character of the surrounding community. But again, it was arbitrary. It was decided by a planning board, which planning boards change, applicants change, until you have something in your ordinances that here are the clear standards. And keep in mind, even though you have performance standards in place, those are just the bare minimum. And the planning board can impose more additional restrictions as conditions, as part of an approval process. So we just need some kind of minimal standards. What the
Guidelines.
town's looking at is, can we have a use in a certain area, and can we put minimum standards to keep this contained, that we feel comfortable that it's going to keep the quality of life in Kennebunkport what we think it should be.
So I have, one of the things that seems to have come up is, I realize when you have a farm and you're genuinely, farming it, it's incredibly hard work. You don't have a lot of time to market yourself as a wedding venue. And so I think it makes sense to work with the surrounding or other resources, and it may be a corporate resource, it could be, certainly be a hotel or resort of this area, because they have the marketing, they have the staff to focus on that. But the farmer themselves don't have that. It's just an enormous amount of labor that you're doing in terms of maintaining your fields, et cetera. And so I can understand that there is a desire to have some sort of a relationship, working relationship with corporate entities in the firm, in the community. I guess what happens is that then that sort of freezes the heart to think what sort of corporate activities are you going to have, and then they don't really want to go down that avenue. But if there is a location in the ordinances where it can be shown that that's a step too far, you're asking for too much. This is really what the townspeople are willing to adopt at this time, and it's something that can be adapted as time goes on, as you see what works and what doesn't work.
Well, once the can is opened, it only gets wider. It never gets smaller.
I know it depends on how well written, but it also.
We're like country lawyers compared to these big corporate lawyers.
And-
I hate to tell you that.
That
I've been around long enough.
That dynamic will always take place.
Yeah.
As technology changes, industries change, you're going to see people always challenging land use ordinances, because municipalities, I'll let you know right now that I know that the free enterprise zone, the same uses that are in the free enterprise zone are all there from 1972.
Right,
That's never changed.
right.
But hotels, motels, those types of establishments have changed over the years. There's lodging establishments, we have short-term rentals. Those activities change. The industries change. I mean, this used to be a
Sure.
fishing town. So how do we keep up with it? There will always be that arms race with developers where we're constantly updating the ordinance. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that a land use ordinance is not a static document. It is to be evolved and changed and amended as the community continues to see that there's issues that need to be addressed.
Can I clarify something? So if conditional use,
Yep.
they still need to go to the planning board for approval.
Yep.
This is just creating some consistent guidelines.
Yeah, so you have three different uses for the board's understanding. There's the permitted uses, which are permitted administratively through the Code Enforcement Office. Conditional uses are approved through the Planning Board, and then special exemptions are done through the Zoning Board of Appeals. Those
So
are the three different.
whatever, so the fear that this somehow opens up Pandora's box, the idea is by creating guidelines, it still needs to go to the planning board, but they have something
Yes,
to benchmark an application against.
correct.
But they
So-
can be more restrictive.
Yes, you can add any conditions to the property at the time of the application, because applications are different. What one person proposes, a non-structural type wedding event where it's a tent versus an actual physical structure, are two different things. And so the planning board has discretion and the ability to add additional conditions which are legally enforceable if they're not followed and adhered to.
Can I throw something out, and then it can just be challenged or whatever, but to sort of move forward? I guess one of my biggest concerns is, and perhaps being a next door neighbor to something like this, is the noise level. And so I would say that could there be some sort of restriction in terms of acoustical music?
Sure,
Is that a possibility?
sure.
So if we go to the land use ordinance, I believe it's section 6 point.
Come on, you can do
I
it.
know.
You usually do it off the top of your
Is
head.
it 6.8 or let's see if I get it close.
Hope you
You know, there's only so much you can memorize.
listen to this when you
Yes.
drive to Pennsylvania tomorrow.
I did. Sound pressure. Where is that at? Oh, 616. So in 246.16, that is your sound pressure level for the town, and it's town-wide. So it doesn't matter if you are a business or a resident, you're not allowed to exceed these decibel pressure limits during the day, so from 7 to 7. You can't exceed 60 dBA and 72 dBc at the property line.
I have a question.
But how many
The
exceptions?
wedding that took place over at the Cape Arundel,
Okay.
that was an enormous, last summer, it was an enormous event. It was beautiful. It was just gorgeous. But the sound was everywhere because you have water around you, which
Sure.
helps that sound transmit.
Mhm.
And I kept thinking at 9 o'clock it'll end, at 10 o'clock it'll end, and at 11 o'clock it was still going. And I thought that that was a real step beyond what was comfortable. And then to be living close to that, it just seemed a little worrisome to me, what people must be feeling, how often will this take place? So I think that's part of the fear that people have in our talking about.
Yeah.
So
weddings.
Galen,
So-
in this case, that's the noise ordinance.
Yep.
If you have a concern, you'd call,
You call a code enforcement office or
Okay.
the police department to file a complaint, and then we would record it. And we have sound meters in town hall, and so we can go out to the property line and measure it.
Yeah, but
and
what
see.
happens on a Saturday night?
So that'd be the police department.
And do they have sound meters?
They have our sound meter that they have access to.
But you know, it's a wedding, so you
Yeah.
don't want to do something like that. But
No.
you wonder, what is this a standard that's being set for future use?
Mhm.
That, I think, is the concern. Obviously,
Yeah,
you
the
want
band
this
didn't
to.
go off at 10 when it
Yeah.
was, if it's,
And
Yeah.
And again, I know that's a condition that was put on the one application. They said no past, I believe it was 10 o'clock, if I remember correctly. But then they also had to meet the DBH for the townwide standards. They understood that because from 7 PM to 7 AM, that threshold goes down to 50 dBA and 62 dBc, depending on which level you're using for the sound meter. So that's already in the standard. They have to meet, that's a minimum standard
Right.
for the town. But yes, operation, they're supposed to stop at 10 o'clock, and if they don't stop at 10 o'clock, that's where we need it recorded. And that's an easy one to do, because then the police in that case, even with the sound meter, if they know it's past 10 o'clock, they can record it, give it to the code enforcement, and then we can legally do an enforcement action against the business.
So,
it's 7 to 7, I'm sorry.
ahead.
And then what happens between 7 and 10?
From 7 PM to 7 AM, that was the DBH level.
Okay, then what happens at 10? You
So
keep
the
talking about a
condition-
cutoff.
Yes, there was the condition that was added on Black Rock Farm, so their events
Oh,
aren't.
their
allowed-
event you're talking about.
Yes, we don't have any standard right
Right.
now. I would think you should add a standard in to protect people from a certain time frame, whether it's 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, whatever you decide. But if that's a standard, then we can then enforce that if it was approved with those conditions, that it's, meeting the performance standards of our stopping all amplified music at a certain time. We can then enforce that.
well, that would be, I think, a big concern that anyone would have in discussing this going forward and voting for it. And I think that the specifics might be helpful to us if we could
I
sort of.
mean, it sounds
parse
like
those out.
that, well, we had a thing down at Sandy Pines last year where they were talking about music and not allowing amplified music. And then I guess at Black Rock Farm, they don't allow.
So at Sandy Pines, they did go through planning board approval, and they did get approval for amplified music.
Okay, I thought they didn't.
They did.
But it was in the afternoon, and it
They stop
was,
it, I think it's like at 8 or 9 o'clock, I forget.
no, it was earlier, I think.
It was?
I thought it was like 3 to 5 or something
Oh.
like that. I thought it was,
Yeah, that was it was early 5 o'clock.
yeah, they said it was sit around the pool in the afternoon.
Hmm.
It was not, what you think of would happen at nighttime with.
I just remember they
Dancing.
did get approval, because people thought
Right.
they didn't get approval for amplified music, and
Right.
they did get approval for that.
Okay, but I don't think there were any complaints afterwards.
I think once people understood that that was it was approved. There was a misunderstanding that they thought that
Oh,
they were never approved for doing amplified music, so we had to go
And everybody's always afraid of the creep,
of course.
because we've all seen the
Of
creep
course,
in
of
town.
course.
afraid of
The creep, they go this far, and then the next week, it's,
the creep.
the next season, it's this plus, and then the next season, if no one stops them, or complains.
It would be really nice if you could, if you have these sound level,
DBA, yeah.
For certain appliances.
that.
You have one on your phone,
if-
too.
If it were something there that, so they would know right away that, the band was getting too loud,
Right.
rather than having,
Well, good
A
management
neighbor.
will do that. Good, I know people who are night managers, and they walk around with their phone like this, and they're always checking. They don't want to,
okay, so that is possible, so that you don't have to have a neighbor call and complain,
Yep.
and then call somebody else, and then.
Yeah, they don't wanna go
take
through
half
that.
an hour to come down to measure, I mean, that just seems so cumbersome.
right, but the problem is with weddings, every weekend is different. Like, there's a new band, there's a new, so it's not like the Nonanton where they're under a very, well-run place, and they're gonna follow all the rules. One-off weddings, even among friends, who's gonna tell the band to quiet down? Somebody has to complain. I guess I'm wondering, since anybody can put up a faux farm instantly, I buy a property, I can make a faux farm, I could hire my wife, she would set you one up, and we're doing this to, out of a special place for the farms that exist particularly. No one can afford to buy farmland in Kennebunkport. Otherwise, there would be more farms, and we have terrible soil in addition. So I'm wondering, why not just do it for anyone in particular areas of town? If you want to have a special event, since the farm distinction to me is illusory. Because we're not saying, of course we want to all do well by Helene at Black Rock, and would love to see that property stay that way, and for her son to be able to keep it. But that's not, the impact on the town. If a subdivision goes in there and 4 houses go in there at some point, that'll happen because her son doesn't want the farm, or,
It's the highest
because he
bid.
can't. There are lots of reasons why things change.
Yeah.
But if we're suddenly allowing events, and we haven't talked about the scope, I understand, and maybe talking about that would help us reach some
Right.
consensus.
Yes,
What's
then we know what
what's
we're
a
talking
crowd?
about.
Are we talking about 100 people? Are we talking about 50 people? Are we talking about 500 people?
So what's your definition of a faux farm?
A faux farm is, if you say you have to be a farm in order to have all these benefits that are not allowed anywhere else in the, so then I generate $5,000 a year doing something. Helene, Nonantum got to know Helene because Helene offered like a community garden. My wife had a spot there too. Lots of people, who knew Helene, she offered spaces to. And they took it to heart, and now they're producing, they're really the mainstay of that enterprise. I don't know if other people are still there. So anybody could, any restaurant would love to have space to do it. And Nonanton's to be commended for, wanting to have good fresh food, locally grown.
Yeah.
It's good for their business. It's great.
Right.
Yeah. So if I again, I'm just hypothetical situation. Someone gets a piece of land in Kennebunkport. Let's say it's not prime farm soils, but it's still, there's pasture land that's available there, and they decide to get milking goats.
Yeah.
They meet your criteria of
Yeah,
at least $5,000.
llamas, whatever.
But then they decide, I want to have this other, maybe it is a part barn, part event venue. The event venues are limited to maybe, let's say, 80 a year total that you can have. Is it necessarily a bad thing that there's now agricultural being brought back to Kennebunkport, where maybe there's cheeses being created, milk, maybe at a smaller scale, because it meets the definition requirements? Is that necessarily a bad thing
No.
to bring that back?
Well,
to Kennebunkport?
if you lose the vistas and the farmland because you're putting up these structures like we saw during COVID, these medical tent
But
hospitals,
you could lose that to a residential subdivision.
I understand that.
So
I understand.
now we're preserving the open space.
But-
Yes, there's maybe one structure that's added, but you're bringing back a sense of what was Kennebunkport with some farming heritage back to the area.
When you say a structure, are you talking about a barn?
Say barn.
Okay,
I was talking about big white tents.
yes, and you're talking
With
about,
those-
I want to make sure, you're talking about barns and you're
Yeah.
talking about big white
Yeah,
tents.
people
Okay.
like to be in either of those for weddings.
Yeah.
It's either a
So
barn
it's
wedding,
limited, so we limited it with the faux farm, how many events they could have. It's not like it's
Yeah.
every weekend.
But can I go back to the definitions are really important. So when you say faux farm, I understand where you're going with that. But somebody has to take care of the goats, they have to take care of the llamas, they've got to get the food in, it's working. It's you're actually really having
It's
to work
protecting
hard.
the open
Yeah.
space.
And then you have this goal of trying to protect. I did look up Martha's Vineyard, only because I feel like it's comparable to Kennebunkport. And they have a very, very active agricultural commission. And these people are out there and trying to engage people, et cetera. And there's an energy there that I think may have to be a part of this on a voluntary basis going forward. If people as a group want to say, I do want to see llamas and goats. And I know that in the town that I came from, I always got a kick out of the fact that we allowed 12 brood sows. And I remember, I'm from Los Angeles, so it took me a moment, what is a brood sow? And so finally I realized, and that's the minimum acres, they have 2 acres. So you can have 2 acres with 12 brood sows, and then another 2 acres with 12 brood sows. And you eventually do get a real sense of what's out there, and you have people come visit, and everybody wants to go and see. So I think that is a possibility. I do understand what you're saying with regards to people taking advantage of the situation. But I kind of think that, when you have animals, you take care of them. It's a lot of work. And food is so expensive right now that if you can grow it yourself in some capacity, it's still a lot of work out there. So they're farmers.
And I guess I'd come back to the comprehensive plan, the part of which says we want to encourage this in some degree, which we haven't talked about farmers markets. I think we decided that, but I think that's a real need in this community that is in the comprehensive plan that we've not addressed
Yeah.
to make it easier in the land use ordinance. So I think there are multiple ways, where you're going, there are multiple ways to encourage something that is also consistent with something that's already been agreed to.
So what do we do next?
We have to propose something, I think.
Well, I think what staff would like is some direction. We gave you the task of doing some homework, which we appreciate some of the homework that was done by the group, and then staff provided you with some homework as well of what we found. So if any of those are sticking to you that you think, okay, this is something that we think would work, we'd like you to explore this aspect of it to draft something, because we need some direction of what you're thinking. And if there is consensus that you don't want to do this, then that's fine. We won't waste any more time on it. But we need to decide what we would like to see. I broke down some notes here about sound concerns. The frequency I heard was a concern with faux farms. How do we address that? Those are all valid. I think hearing what you think we need to address would help staff then to draft something that would be meaningful for you to review.
So is it fair to say we're open to enabling some kind of social gatherings that can bring additional sources of income? But we also want to make sure that there are guidelines that make sure that it protects the community, such as frequency, sound limits, traffic issues,
size.
size.
And costs to the town. I think, you know, the
What would
town.
be borne by,
Yeah, these, when you have a special, I like the idea of the, you know, special events or the social gatherings. I like those words. I like social gathering. But it seems to be so inclusive with all sorts of different friendly activities. But I think that, well, anyway, I'll hold back on that. So, thank you.
so I think that Gorham language actually
Yeah.
might be a good model.
Have you been to Gorham?
I have not.
Oh, Gorham is a great place to drive through. It has remarkable, remarkable farms, and I drive through it and think, oh my gosh, how can they handle this?
But we're not there.
Right.
We're not in Gorham,
I
we're
know
not
we're
in,
not.
we're not in Cape Elizabeth, we're not in Scarborough, and we're never going to be there. Go look at the US soil maps. There is a reason no one is farming in this town. Helene has the best soil in the whole town. She's like one of the only, like the top 2 tiers of, it's just terrible soil.
But you can have other things on
Yes,
on the
No, I
soil.
understand, farming is
The goats
much
or
broader than that.
cows
Right.
or- yeah.
Right, but I'm just thinking, you know,
I want
if you're
to
dreaming that
put
farming is
some
coming
goals.
back to town as a result of this, it's not, you know, at least in my humble view, it's not a dream.
Well,
That's going to be.
I will push back on that a little bit in that I do think you're going to see a trend of more people having non-commercial keeping of livestock for their own personal subsistence.
Yeah, that's a different issue.
Well, that's agriculture.
Right.
So that's, you know,
That's
even though
your
it's
12
not
birds.
commercial,
Right.
it's
Caitlin,
it's
did you
gonna,
say
you're gonna.
chickens are not allowed in the land use ordinance?
Didn't say that.
No, chickens are allowed, aren't they?
It is a
We-
complicated matter that I did not discuss right now.
I thought we had a right to eat in this state.
Correct. There's a constitutional right to food.
Farm, yeah, to
Yeah.
food.
Yeah.
Right.
The
It's good that something's protected.
Yeah.
So municipalities
Not for long.
can put standards on that to curb what the impact could be. But yes, you have a constitutional right to food.
Okay.
Yes.
And the animals that produce food.
You raised a question,
no?
you raised a question about the faux farm.
Yeah,
I think that's a real concern. You can have businesses who somehow ingratiate themselves, integrate themselves into a farm and basically take it over. Is there, I'm a city boy, I know nothing about farms. Is there a way to define a farm?
It
It
is
walks like a
defined.
duck, talks like a duck,
It's
Well,
defined.
it ain't a duck.
we
It's
can-
defined. We've talked in one of the
We
prior
have?
meetings, right?
well, there are various definitions, but we could make up our own definition.
But we haven't, isn't there existing state definition?
Yeah.
that we
I would-
discussed 2
I
meetings
would
ago?
caution, I do think we would have to talk to the town attorney
Sure.
about changing the definition from the state.
Right.
Because the state does clearly say, this is what the definition of agriculture is. And going more restrictive than the state would be in violation of the right to farm law, which is, again, protecting agriculture from town ordinances. So that's what, I would caution that we would be careful of the definition of agriculture.
So as long as an entity could satisfy the state's criteria to be
Right.
a farm,
Correct.
they can do all the other extraneous stuff they want, as long as they still meet the criteria.
So
I
Tom,
didn't- I
I'd
didn't
come back
s-
to.
Well,
I
they
think
can't now.
I'd come back to,
They can run a farm now, but they can't run a wedding.
but I think I'd come back, I can't remember who made the point, but if someone did if there was, you know, such a big profit opportunity that people started buying up land to create farms that also served as weddings and other purposes, that's a way of actually protecting, preserving land and not having overdevelopment. So I'm not even sure, and as long as we create the conditions and give, I'm not sure.
But you can
that's a
grow
big-
$5,000 of food in a room this big easily.
But-
Square foot farming.
So maybe
You know, it's,
so a minimum square footage might be a part of what we ask staff to incorporate into the guidelines.
So I think, again, you
That-
can't change the definition of agriculture, but I think you can make the performance standards for the agritourism, that use, which is accessory to agriculture.
right.
You just make sure that provision's in there. You can make that standard more restrictive, because then again, it's not agriculture is the main focus, it's something else that is, it's driving events to the site.
Do you guys ever hear of something called fruit or vegetable depots?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you from.
Fruit or vegetable depots.
Can you go to the microphone?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I ran a company, my partner and I owned a company, we detected VOCs, volatile organic compounds. long story short, there are businesses out there where they basically pick vegetables, store them in warehouses for months, maybe years. They basically put them into hibernation by pumping in, I guess it's ethylene and a bunch of other kind of stuff. They put the vegetables and fruit to sleep. I've been 6, 7 stories of vegetables and fruit. And then, like Hannaford's wants a big order, they call up, they take them out, put them in a ripening room, and overnight they grow from 2 years old to adults, overnight. So you could have farms that are multi-story. So you could have a 10-story farm and treat things the way they treat it outside, but all inside the building. How do we satisfy the
That could be a
definitions of
restriction.
Maine?
And that's under state law, they are allowed as long as they're meeting the definition of agriculture. Because there was a movement many years ago, back in the 1980s, I believe it was in Maine, where they had a concern of CAFOs, so that was concentrated animal feeding operations. They were concerned, towns were concerned about having these big pig lots and all these other things. And so towns started putting ordinances in place to restrict those type of activities. And the courts have ruled that it's unconstitutional. You cannot regulate agriculture when there's the right to farm law exists. So there are still some people that have like piggeries and stuff on the books, but you can't regulate the normal operations of agriculture if they are operating within the state parameters of what agriculture is allowed. So they're meeting their manure management plan, they're doing their pesticide application away from water bodies. As long as they're meeting those requirements, we as a town cannot impose additional restrictions on the normal keeping of agriculture.
So, in the free enterprise zone, what's our height limit that we allow for?
We can restrict building restrictions, that's I think 35 feet.
Right, so that can be
So-
done,
That- yes.
even for a farm?
No. No, because I believe barns are excluded from that definition.
Barns specifically, or a 6-story, there's a lot of vertical growing starting, usually in cities, because they got big old buildings that are,
Can I
they want to repurpose.
suggest we might be off the main focus
Wait.
of what we're trying to solve?
Yep.
No, I'm just wondering about
Yeah.
heights. You raise a good question. If we encourage more farms, do we have 6-story buildings on Arundel Road? I'll use that, because it's one of my favorite roads to drive down.
What I was trying to raise the point was if you have a relatively, a footprint, and the state law says you have to have a certain amount of acreage, whatever it is, square footage, whatever it is, devoted to farming, you could have that vertically and
Right.
satisfy the criterion.
Right.
And have all the rest of the plot devoted to industrial or entertainment activities. That was why I raised that point.
Yeah.
Are there odor
No, it's-
restrictions?
A real farm, but on a small
Odor's always a
footprint.
problem.
But
It's a
I
nuisance.
keep thinking that the conditional use part of this can protect us to a certain extent, because
But-
they have to go before the planning board
Which,
and say
which,
they're gonna do a 6-story building with, I mean,
But it's always good for the planning board to have restrictions as to what they can.
well, the question is whether the
allow.
planning
well,
board could.
well, maybe they couldn't,
planning-
because it's.
Agriculture is a
actual-
permitted use in your
Right.
zone, so that would not go in front of the planning board.
Code enforcement?
So I come in for my 6-story warehouse with, hydroponic growing.
Again, I'll
Can I-
have to find that. I'll find that. I know there is a thing in here about because they said about barns and, the silos and everything else. Well, they're well above the
Sure, and
building
have
height
always been,
requirements,
right.
and they've always been. And so I know they're exempt from building height standards, but everything else would have to,
Okay,
house and,
if you could get an answer on that
Yeah.
sometime, that'd be
If
great.
somebody has a conditional use and they're using it, sort of, I guess, which is maybe what is happening at Black Rock Farm, sort of.
yes.
And then they go beyond it. It's something that wasn't addressed. I mean, does the planning board, does somebody, I guess it would have to be, somebody would complain that they have this other activity that wasn't allowed. Is
Right.
that right? Somebody would have to complain, and then they would be called into the planning board. So if you
Or
go
the code
beyond
office.
what is originally agreed to.
He would if he gets a call, he would cite them if they're in violation. He could shut them down. Hidden Pond was shut down years ago when their septic system blew up because they were over, they had expanded their footprint and allowed much bigger events than they had, that was in their site plan?
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, I found your answer to your
Oh,
question. So
great.
I do appreciate the board because you guys are helping me not get dementia, and that's good, get my brain exercising with memory. So this is under 246.2, this is height restrictions. And so the first, like, 3 sentences explains about, like, which zones allow for what, how many feet
Sure.
high. And then there's this other sentence, it says, these restrictions shall not apply to farm buildings not used for human habitation, municipal salt and sand sheds, church steeples, water towers, flagpoles, windmills, or antennas, provided that such structures are not used for human occupancy
Right,
and are set back from the property lines at a distance at equal their height.
height.
So there you
So
go.
you could put in a 6-story
Yeah.
building and have a grow farm, a vertical grow farm,
If it's part of a farm.
right now,
If it's part of a farm,
if it's part of the farm.
yes.
Well, you would just, I buy a big field, it's now a farm.
And that's
So-
where your full farm would come in.
Hydroponic
to-
weddings.
As a concern.
Hydroponic weddings, yeah, come.
So we really need to be careful what the definition of farm is.
But we can't
We
define
can't.
farm, it's already been
Yeah.
defined by the state.
Yeah.
Right.
Right,
Right.
So I think I would suggest we focus on where we were, which is, I think you've heard several examples of things that we'd want to try to regulate or guide.
So there would be social gathering. I love your name, I love the words of social gathering. That's just my 2 bits. But we've talked about addressing noise, the frequency of events,
Mhm.
the town costs, that's me, the impacts of cost to the town.
And what would those
Size.
be? That's what
Well, my thought is if there was a social gathering, would there be a requirement of, oversight by personnel, permits, town personnel, police called to perhaps moderate traffic? If there's a positioning of signs that's required and the town ends up doing that, personnel doing that, are there costs that go to the town that should be included in the permit? Or the arrangement with perhaps the farm location, that your costs incurred, and, $500 is part of that to the town for the expenses incurred by the town. I don't know what they might
Right.
be.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we would work with that. I know, like, traffic, I think that's a good one to focus on, because I've seen that at certain agritourism locations where they do UPEC or something, and you need to control traffic. They have to control the traffic. And they sometimes have flaggers that are out on the main road because of how just popular the location is, which, again, I don't think that's going to happen here. I agree, productive soils is less here. But could it be, could there be a traffic concern? So that, I think, would be under the traffic plan that they'd have to submit.
But
as
they
part of their
would,
site
they
plan.
would pay for a policeman if a policeman had to be there.
That's what I would want to just make sure that they would
Yeah,
be we are not carrying the burden of
Correct.
the event.
I guess the other thing could possibly be if you had a couple of things going on at the same time, that you might have not enough police available in
Oh.
town to cover them if necessary, but maybe, I don't know if they pull from other towns or if they just have to
they'd have to,
arrange them on different days.
right. Well, I think you have your frequency, right? So there's only gonna be so many.
Yeah, but
Oh.
if everybody picks, the
there's only 8
second weekend
weekends.
in July
Right.
or
There's
something.
only 8 weekends,
Mhm.
so 8 means the entire season at Goose Rocks, at Kennebunkport.
Mm.
You get some in the fall maybe, but
Is this just 8?
basically,
Okay.
it's 2 months. School gets out on like the 23rd of June or whatever, and
July and
families
August.
don't come till,
I see what you're saying. Oh.
There-
Did
there are
anybody
plenty
else?
of weddings in September, October.
I
Yeah,
think it'd be a lovely
Fall?
time to have a,
Yeah,
Yeah.
the wedding
Fall.
season.
So
it
what,
goes through the fall, right?
and the leaf peepers come
Not-
by, so.
Hey, can we control the tourism buses?
I just had some notes. Did anybody else have anything else that they felt should be addressed?
I'm not sure, did you mention size?
I have size here, wastewater is one that I put down, is a concern.
Parking? You got parking?
Traffic parking.
Traffic parking, yeah, I
Yeah.
can put that.
I guess within noise, the amplification versus acoustic.
So I guess that's, one of the concerns, if you had like a, this is, I don't know, Woodstock, you had a Woodstock that you wanted to have here in Kennebunkport.
Sure.
Could you, address that?
I don't think that was
Depends what-
permitted.
It depends what size limitations we put on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw there was a documentary on Led Zeppelin, and I thought, oh, I'd really like to see that. I remember when that was in existence. So, what else did you think of that might be a concern?
Do you have Gorham handy? Anything else?
So what about the issue of,
Bathrooms.
yeah, we got that.
Sanitary?
I have that for wastewater.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Gorham has one provision that I think is kind of interesting, where they tailor the size of the lot required to the number of attendees that
Yeah.
will be there.
We talked about that
Mm-hmm.
in the past, not tonight.
So, anything, so 0 to 100 guests requires at least 10 acres, and anything 100 to 250 guests requires at least 20 acres. So, I heard some
Context, how's Black Rock, how big is Black Rock Farm?
30 something.
There's
So I heard some concerns about like parking if the lot's not big enough for people to park the cars there, so that might be a way to get around that concern. If you have, 20 acres, you're gonna be able to park enough cars there.
That's a really good point.
What's a good point?
So a number per acre.
The relationship of
A
parking,
ratio per.
if you've got 100
Mhm.
cars,
So if you're gonna have an event with like 25 attendees, you don't necessarily need 30 acres of land. You could get away with 5 acres, but if you're going to have a 200-person event, then in order to prevent things like parking overflow, there are options to address those concerns that other towns have had.
and at Black
As well.
Rock, weren't they required to bus them there? Because she didn't really have
Mhm.
the parking
Right,
space, and she probably didn't want to ruin what good soil she has.
right.
And I think that that's kind of what Cumberland is
Compacting.
getting at with their street, street requirements as well, is just, I've heard parking as a big concern, that I think that there's a lot of ways that we can also sort of work around the parking issue.
I mean, yeah, I remember attending my own cousin's wedding out in western PA, and they had it at a farm. And they shuttled us from
They picked up
From
at
the hotel.
hotels.
Yep, right from the hotel. I didn't have to use my car the entire time, and
Right,
again, safety, for the people that
Absolutely.
they're drinking, they're having a festive time.
yeah.
They're
very
in a
common.
controlled atmosphere, and I think that's what I really appreciate about Black Rock, is that they took care of that logistical issue that would be of concern for the community, is drunk driving and possible injuries and accidents.
So will that be part of the consideration that you put in this? Could there be a
Whatever we
minimum?
want.
So
Yeah,
there
so
be a
that's the
Until the
direction
lawyer
we're
says
looking
no.
for. So whatever the committee says is what we will be
So-
working on drafting and researching.
So traffic
Well-
patterns, transportation
Traffic,
slash traffic.
Right.
And what about a minimum lot size for a commercial, something like, it should
Yeah.
be, are we talking about 5 acres, or are we talking, you'd
Could
have
you
a
just do a
small?
ratio of some sort, number of people per acre?
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice formula, the one.
So something like 5 acre farm, I think somebody here said that they really only have 2 or 3 acres, right? I mean, so.
Oh, no, they have a lot of land.
They
It goes
do.
down.
5
to-
acre?
It goes
Yeah.
Oh,
behind,
They have a lot.
behind where the store is, or,
Okay, so
It
there's a
goes
lot
down the hill,
more, yeah,
right?
So it's more than that, maybe it is.
It's
5.
like the prettiest place in Kennebunkport. You should drive down that road.
I've been.
You think you're in the middle of Vermont.
Okay, so you
it's-
can go further down.
Yeah, just go on the private road. It's gorgeous.
Where's that at?
Off of Route 9 and on the way to.
Where
Concord.
you haven't
5
been?
acre farm is?
Oh, okay.
3 acre farm, what's it called?
5.
5 acre
5,
farm.
yeah. I mean,
Blueberry
there's
pie.
30 families who live down that street.
They have a lot of other stuff too.
It's a
They're-
beautiful,
The peanut butter cups are good too.
yeah.
So what else is of concern?
I think
to
we
us?
probably, I keep coming back to Gorham because I thought it sounded,
Yeah,
Gorham did have they had a nice comprehensive
right.
yeah.
But they have a lot more
set of
farms.
standards.
But they,
Mhm.
I guess one question, do we, the accessory to farm activity versus not accessory to a farm activity, a wedding versus apple picking, do we think the rules should be the same? Do we think there should be different rules? Are we encouraging one kind of activity versus another?
That's why I was thinking that the term social gathering was interesting. It
But that's anything, that's,
could be either, it could be apple picking or
right.
could be a
A
small
wedding.
concert, could be a,
But my question is, do we
do we want to encourage
favor?
the things that are more agriculturally oriented and not restrict them?
Right.
Is that,
So
And-
I'll use the example, besides, I know we've been talking about weddings, we know about them. So haunted house, haunted hayride. Should that be limited frequency, how many they should have? I'm gonna give you some tough ones.
Yeah, no, that is a tough one.
Yeah, so like.
so that's
it's hard,
non-ag, that's a, feels like an adjacent use, but not a core agricultural use, and it's something we,
Do we wanna limit it or we don't,
Typically
I
those,
think we limit in the similar way.
versus a U-pick or like a, you know?
But those different things have different drawbacks. that
I'm doing a
say-
farm-to-table tasting event.
But you'd be looking for hayride versus the haunted house. They both bring in revenue. They both probably consume as much parking maybe as the others. There's a lot less, I guess relevance to the haunted house has nothing to do with farming per se, whereas at least the hayride, they can at least ride around and see the farm and have things explained to them.
Well, they could
I
be
would
selling
suggest-
pumpkins at the
yeah, sorry.
haunted
No,
house.
please.
but like,
I would suggest that the restrictions we're trying to put on actually are somewhat universal. So, because it's about crowds, it's about safety, it's about traffic, whether it's a wedding, a concert, a haunted house, as long as we have noise restrictions, traffic restrictions, health-oriented things. I think, I'm sure you'll stump us with something, but
I guess, I
you wouldn't want 1,000 people coming into a haunted house.
no,
I
but,
agree,
but a good
but-
question is, you know, if someone's having a farm maze, they do it for like a month.
Yeah.
The harvest season comes in, and for a month they do, or for 2 weeks before, you know, Halloween, they do haunted house, or
So it's not, it wouldn't be,
So-
8 times a year wouldn't
wouldn't work for
Or
them.
I have goat yoga. I'm on a goat feed for some reason. Goat yoga, like that's a, you know.
I sort
Put
of
a
think
limit?
that somehow,
Well,
and I
I don't
don't
think there'll be
know how
200
you
people.
would,
There
showing
would
up.
you
I
have
don't
some
even know what
way
it
of showing preference for real agriculture-oriented things, but I don't know how you would do that.
I'll propose, I think we'll still come back to whatever the activity is, as long as we're guiding traffic, size of crowds, et cetera. I'm not sure that's our place to determine what's a good activity and a bad activity.
Except
But
you
it
would
is-
have some,
Well,
there's some drawbacks to, for instance, weddings, be much more noisy if nothing else.
Well, if
Well,
it's a
but
that's
small
where we're gonna
wedding,
address noise.
it's not. Or, and if you're regulating the noise and if you're limiting the number of people, a wedding isn't necessarily going to be.
It's a good thing.
But a lot of
It's
farm,
actually a good-
farm accessory, farm-dependent activities are like daytime, whereas social events tend to be, you know, weddings start at 5 o'clock for some reason,
Yeah,
and
oh,
go
but
into the evening,
but
and
it
they're
could-
done at, you know,
it
10
could
or
be
11.
something.
so I think there is a difference between daytime and nighttime activities.
Yes.
But
So
you
hours
could
of
have
operation.
corporate
Yes,
events
hours
that
of
are,
operation.
and during the day. The corporate events could be during the day. I think there was an example of, you know, people having a meeting at the
Right.
venue and maybe a little side activity of learning how to can asparagus or whatever. But, you know, so that could be a daytime activity that's not,
What are we doing for the fishermen?
that, you know, is more.
I don't know if there's any assistance from the police in terms of activities that they think might be more burdensome or a little bit concerned about permitting those.
I don't know.
We can ask them, I mean, I'm sure they probably don't know all the agricultural type events. The other one I know from experience that brings a huge crowd of people is like a horse show. That's one that, I know we don't have stables right now. Well, we do have a stable. So could that draws a lot of people, it draws a lot of trailers, trucks, and can bring 200 and some people to an area where they're just doing riding shows with horses. That's
Weddings can also be daytime weddings. They don't have to go into the night, right? And
No, that's
we
true,
could
but-
restrict it to daytime if we want.
Mhm.
Or have a cap on, 10 o'clock.
So some of these towns have like the end time that you can be you have to be done breaking down an event by like 7 p.m.
Right,
Yeah.
So
Right.
there are those restrictions on earlier times of the day
yeah.
in other towns as
And
well.
and it goes to what your maybe concern has been, that if we open the door too much, then it's hard to pull back. So maybe it can start with, like ending at 7 p.m. and then if people feel that is problematic. But starting at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I think might be a little bit too much for the townspeople to address right now.
Yeah, plus, nighttime strangers driving down rural roads
Yeah,
is not exactly a great
right.
look. Our roads are dark,
Yeah, no
Um,
streetlights.
they're curvy, per the comprehensive plan. We like to maintain those curvy roads.
Well, we want more connections, we want them to all pass through.
Yeah,
So you could, I'm not as concerned, because I don't think this is as pervasive a problem, but you could, the limit of how many events you could have,
Sorry.
Yeah.
you could make it more limited for nighttime events.
right,
So,
Oh.
I'm making this up,
Sure.
four events that can go till 10 o'clock, but daytime events that end by 7.
yeah. I like no nighttime events.
Not
Yeah,
Frankly.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
think
I'd
that's
just
good way
be a
to
little
start.
concerned micromanaging them too much.
Right.
But let's,
No, but,
I think
Do we
having
want-
a clear,
What-
frequency and,
yeah, what do we want the future of this town to be? What's the vision?
And I don't
Do-
think that
do we-
Kennebunkport is a nighttime town. Well, maybe, no, it's more Kennebunk, like Lower Village. I mean, that area is a
Stays
active
alive.
nighttime.
Right,
But I think the rest of Kennebunkport is
dies pretty early.
quiet.
Yeah, it is quiet.
It is quiet, yeah.
Yeah.
And people love that about it. They love the quiet here.
Right. Yeah, you drive to,
But I think there's a broader population. Again, part of what we also say in the comprehensive plan is we want to be supportive of local year-round residents, but we also do want to be welcoming. So I'm not sure it's our place to say,
but
Everyone
we're doing a great
everyone
job at that.
right, everyone likes the quiet.
Right. Well, but see, the people can do the daytime
Right.
activities in Kennebunkport, and then it won't hurt the business, the nighttime business of the restaurants and bars in downtown,
Good thought.
working within.
So Gorham, I think, is an interesting tool.
And we need better soil, is what I heard, for better agriculture.
Okay, should we wind this up for tonight?
Unless you
we're
have
good.
votes.
Okay. When is our next meeting? Who's got,
It would be in 2
I
weeks.
believe the 6th of May. We have a 5 Tuesday month here in April, so I have 2 weeks between this and the next meeting, if we stick with our regular schedule.
Is it the 29th of April, or is it?
I think it'll be the 6th of May. We usually do the 1st and 3rd Tuesday.
Oh.
So
Oh,
if we
Right.
stick with that schedule, it'll be the 6th of May.
right,
29th better.
Is everyone good for that?
I'm better for the 29th, but that, whatever, don't do it around me.
yeah, I don't think, we never do 3 in a month,
Okay.
unless we have a gun to our head.
And it throws production off, so.
Yeah, thank you.
For May 6th, everyone's fine with?
Actually, yeah, I think.
Okay.
Okay, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So-
I move that we adjourn?
Second.
Thank you, Jane.
So
Second,
Jane-
Ann.
Jane made the motion to adjourn, and
Ann
Ann made the
was second.
second to adjourn.
All in favor, raise your hands, say yes.
Yes.
All in favor. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see everybody.